Well, good afternoon and welcome to today's panel on turning technologies into the markets of tomorrow. My name is Azeem Azhar and I'm the founder of Exponential View. I'm an author and investor specializing in exponential technologies and their potential. Now, today's panel is touching on a critical question. Technologies in isolation are interesting, but when a market ferments around a technology, that's when the magic really happens. Markets enable the provision of goods and services by coordinating businesses and consumers, and ultimately are the channel by which we deliver the benefits of technologies to the broadest groups. But markets are imperfect. They can become overactive in some sectors and leaving other critical ones unaddressed. So one important question is, how does the public sector play a role in this? What is the balance between private innovation and public activity in creating healthy and nurtured markets? Now, we've got an expert panel today that's going to cover these issues. We have Paula Ingabire, who's the Minister of ICT and Innovation for Rwanda and a young global leader here at the forum. We have André Kudelski, who is a long-standing friend of the forum, the chairman and CEO of Kudelski Group, and also the chair of InnoSuisse, the Swiss innovation agency. Deemah Al Yahya, who is the Secretary General for Digital Cooperation, for the Digital Cooperation Organization, which is a new organization. And finally, Erik Brynjolfsson, a professor at the Digital Economy Lab at Stanford University. Now, the forum last week published a very, very interesting new report called The Markets of Tomorrow, Turning Technologies into New Sources of Global Growth. The report itself included a survey of top business executives in many, many countries around the world. And what I'd like to do is perhaps start by pulling up a couple of the results from that survey. So if I could see the chart, yes. So this is a chart, pardon me, the map. Yeah, the map. This is a map that shows the technologies of highest strategic importance in each company as voted for, selected by senior execs in those companies. And I think we see some really interesting differences. If you look at the advanced economies, you see this sort of light purple, which is in Canada, the United Kingdom, bits of Scandinavia, Australia, climate change mitigation technologies being the ones of most strategic importance. You also see healthcare technologies playing quite a strong role in the United States and in France. But when you start to look at emerging economies, particularly in the global south, the key technologies are the agricultural technologies, which you see across South America and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, but also power storage and generation. So there's a real divide that we see in the importance of the perceived technologies. But then the other interesting part in this report, which I do urge you to read, is when leaders were asked, what are the barriers to creating new markets in technologies? Well, we get this other result, and if you look at the chart, you'll see that the most popular, most important barrier was a lack of skills and talent, followed by the need for infrastructure and initiative from the public sector, number 3 there. Quite surprisingly, perhaps, right down the bottom is an agreement on the value of the product or asset. So this provides quite a lot of food for thought for us to get started with the panel. And perhaps if I can turn to you first, Minister, when you look at the barriers up there, do they resonate with how you think about forming markets?
Thank you very much. I think I do agree with the results that we're seeing. The absence of the right skills and talent will also mean that you're not able to connect the supply and demand side of markets. So there may be unmet needs within a market, but if you don't have the right talent and skills to respond to those unmet needs, then that will definitely be an obstacle to creating a new market or even enabling environment for any products to be able to gain traction within that market. But I also agree with you, because I think everything we see, whether it's products or services, at the end of the day, it's the value proposition. That is what is going to drive demand. And so it's quite surprising for me, even just looking at it, that it comes at the bottom of the obstacles. But I guess context also matters in many ways. So I think, while this will average out what the results have looked like at the different segments of the economies, I think you may see some of these shifts depending on the markets that we'll be looking at.
Right, thank you. And André, from your perspective of the Swiss Innovation Agency, when you think about what are the barriers to creating markets, are you in agreement with our business experts, or do you see some other nuances?
First, I think that elements that are put here are very valid. I give you one specific example, the question of talent. The question is between the time you decide to educate someone and when the person is available on the market, it's not overnight. But you have another issue, and that I have seen that, witnessed that in discussion in Switzerland, is that most of the time the different stakeholders are representing the industry of today. And here you need to take an abstraction and to look forward and to be ready to educate people for companies that don't exist today. Mm-hmm. In addition to that, you have another element that is pretty important, is that the key element about education is not about just learning to do one thing, but to learn. Because with the evolution of the technology, what you know today will be obsolete maybe 5 years from now. And if you are not ready to continue to learn, that will be very difficult. But there are many other elements, but I will leave.
Yeah. I think that point about education and obsolescence is an interesting one. We'll try to return to that. Deemah, in your new role, you're helping countries overcome obstacles. What are the ones that you see?
Well, I think that one of the most biggest obstacles in terms of supporting in digital transformation of a lot of countries, which is the availability of data. And knowing exactly what is the need, meaning what is the supply and what is the demand, and directing the right investments and the right technologies to the countries that are in need. And I think that is a big barrier in expediting that digital transformation, and just being that facilitator that assesses and analyzes what is the need to accelerate the transformation, and provide that pipeline of the opportunity and innovation and technology to help and support such kind of economies.
That's an interesting perspective, the lack of data, the lack of the transmission mechanism of the need. Yes. Back into the market. Erik, I don't want to pigeonhole you as the professor who will give us the orthodox view of what prevents markets from being created. But as you look at the many digital markets that you have studied, what have you learnt about what accelerates them and what holds them back?
Well, I think Deemah was spot on in terms of the importance of data. And one example of that is that I was just talking to Will Marshall at Planet Labs, and we all know that there's a big externality of carbon trading and climate change. And part of the problem is that when markets can form when you have clear measurements and property rights of what all the parties are doing. But in the case of carbon, a lot of it is affecting other people in unknown ways. Planet Labs is measuring every square meter of the Earth several times a day and can detect how much carbon is being emitted, and they're just now providing data to be able to track that. That's going to enable a market and internalize some of those externalities. That's an example of what Deemah is saying. But more broadly, I think what we're seeing is as you've written, Azeem, the digitization of so much and exponential improvements in those technologies that are just pulling away. And the reason we're not seeing it translate into as much productivity growth as we would have liked is that our organizations, our institutions, and our skills and talent are not changing fast enough. And that gap between the exponentially improving technologies, especially digital and AI, and our slower changing organizations and institutions and skills is where most of the challenges, and that's why the markets aren't forming. We need to close that, and that will boost productivity a lot faster.
Well, thank you for the beautiful pitch on my book. I really appreciate that, Erik. Can we lose the chart now? I'll put the normal web back. Thank you very much. On that productivity point that you've raised there, I mean, Deemah, when we look at productivity and growth slowing in countries, whether they're advanced economies or emerging economies, how do you see the role of new markets as something that might change that statistic in our favour?
Well, definitely it will open new doors of opportunities, either for job creation or also for economical returns. But I will go back to the fundamentals. You know, in a time where we're looking at emerging technologies and we're looking at the likes of the positive impact economically from the metaverse and Web 3.0 and other technologies, there is a big portion which is the half of a population still not connected, and we have a major issue when it comes to the infrastructure. Infrastructure meaning either connectivity, policy, regulation, and reforms, and also human capital development. So any emerging technology that comes with it, any positive economy, cannot thrive and prosper without having the fundamentals. And this is where we have to innovate quickly and come up with new solutions to not only the availability of that infrastructure, but also the affordability and also the availability of the devices and the enablers to prosper and be an active contributor in the economy.
So, Minister, infrastructure, I hear the word, and I think that will fall into your sort of category. How, when you look at here these advanced sort of technologies like metaverse or quantum, but at the same time you're thinking about infrastructure and affordable, democratized, widely available infrastructure, how do you bridge that, and where is your focus?
So a couple of things, yes, and I do agree with Deemah. There's access, which is one thing, and I think pretty much, and we had a session earlier in this same room where we're discussing the foundations for connectivity, and one of the things you look at that countries have done very well at is just trying to figure out the access bit. But the other bit that still needs to be unlocked and invested in heavily is affordability, because we still have about 3.8 billion people that live in areas of coverage but are still not able to access it because of the issue of cost, and whether it's the cost of the device or the cost of the service itself just makes it impossible for them to benefit meaningfully. So yes, there will be policies that have to be put in place, and that attention that we're focusing on, how do we ensure that access is there but it's also affordable for those people that live in areas that are already covered. But then I think where the challenge is, and just piggybacking on some of Deemah's thoughts, is on the regulation side. And what we see, especially now that we're talking about markets for new technologies, is that the rate at which innovation is happening is very fast. And so policies and regulations are almost having to play catch up. Mm-hmm. And so when you don't have the right regulatory environment, then in many ways we create barriers for how quickly a product or a service can be tested in the market, and even to understand what scale is going to look like. And so I feel like that, even as we think about democratizing access to infrastructure, is how that also gets to be accompanied with the right regulations, or even the openness to really testing these things, because sometimes we can't regulate what we don't know.
Well, you brought a smile to my face, because of course we've come from a 10 or 15 year heritage where the mantra of some of the innovators was move fast and break things, let's get going without there needing to be regulations in place, and well, someone will clear up the mess afterwards. And it was interesting that you said that you would like to see, perhaps I'm paraphrasing, the regulations correctly in place so markets can form appropriately. Now, André, I'm wondering, you're working with a lot of innovators, so would you like to see regulatory frameworks take shape alongside the innovations, or do you think it's sort of necessary that they have to happen afterwards?
It's extremely difficult to regulate first, because if you have a regulation that is creating extra constraint, innovation will just not happen. But you have, however, sometimes some regulations that may make sense, is to be able to create a new market. Because most of the time you are not coming with a vacuum of regulation. You have a regulation that is addressing the incumbents in an industry that may be slightly different. And if you have not something that is opening the door for doing something new, it will be very difficult. I give you a typical example, fintech. If by default you have the same rules as for the traditional finance, it will be very difficult to innovate.
Right.
Then you need to have an open door to do some innovation, and then you will regulate later once you know where the innovation will bring us. Because one of the key elements about innovation is that we don't know from day one where we will end. And that is one of the fundamental elements about innovation.
I think that's where sandboxes come in very, yes.
Yeah. So say something more about sandboxes for all the audience as well. I think they're an important factor.
Sandboxes as an approach is something that we're experimenting with in Rwanda, and particularly in the financial sector as well as the healthcare industry. Financial sector, again, to the point that he makes around fintech, there's all these new ways of driving financial inclusion, leveraging different technologies. And so the absence of understanding what is at stake and how do we cater for that at least gives you maybe a year to sort of test it in this sandbox environment. And once you are comfortable that you can have a minimum set of regulations or policies to allow for scale and market testing, then you let it happen. And we're seeing that, of course, even in the healthcare industry, where we're looking at particularly how you use AI to drive access to healthcare or different interventions in healthcare. And there's all these models, and of course, there's an issue around data privacy, and that is always at stake, especially when you're talking about patient data. But the thing is, as a proof of concept country, we also can't afford to be in wait and see mode until everyone figures out what regulations will make sense and if an innovation is a right fit for our market. And so what we've chosen to do as a proof of concept is say, let's figure out performance-best type of regulations, knowing that there'll never be a one-size-fits-all set of regulations for the different innovations, and then work with the innovators. If you come to us and you have a solution, we'll say, okay, here are the risks that we can think of, because there's some unknown risks that we can't think of at this point in time until you test your product, and let's test this, and then we will use your use case as a way to improve the regulations that we have, and then build a market and industry around that.
So what's interesting here, I think, is that we're rehabilitating the idea of regulation as a type of up-regulation. It's not merely down-regulation. In lots of discussions what we have about regulation and entrepreneurs and technologies, it's all about down-regulation, and we're starting to see models of up-regulation. Erik, please.
Yeah, I mean, building on the healthcare example that Paula brought up, I was just having a conversation with David Agus in the hallway there before, who's done a lot of innovation in the healthcare space, and he was describing how the digital records regulation in the United States, where it was required that medical records be made electronic. It was an imperfect rollout, and there are a lot of mistakes with it, but the core thing is that he now has an enormous amount of data where they can compare different treatments across very large populations and use machine learning to analyze it and better understand what's doing. So there's a case where the regulation spurred a wave of innovations, and he was very happy with the ability to detect new kinds of cancers and figure out treatments that work for them at scale in a way that simply wouldn't have been possible without that regulation.
It feels like there's going to be a Goldilocks zone, though, of public sector regulation to try to create markets, right? Not too much and not too little. So, yes, well, Erik, how do you find that?
Quick point. I'm hesitant to call it a Goldilocks zone because that sort of implies there's some place in the middle. I think it's more a matter that in some places you need more, in some places you need less. There's good and bad regulation. So it's not that there should sort of be this medium amount across the board. It's really that some places should be closer to permissionless, others you're going to need a lot more. Unfortunately, that kind of heterogeneity requires a lot of intelligent policymakers to know when to be maybe a little bit heavy-handed and when to have a light touch, but it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Deemah, I'll ask you to build on that idea. I mean, partly you're going to have to contend with that sort of question, right? Where do the policymakers have the capability? and how will they know when to be heavy-handed and when to be light touch? So how would you imagine addressing this?
Exactly. You know, just as Erik was talking, I was thinking about how also not all, every shoe fits all, but also it depends on the country and either the political regimes in these countries and how quickly are they adapting to these new technologies. And I think the more agile nations come up with the new regulations quicker, like the likes of Rwanda, and therefore enables other countries that are very left behind or they're very slow in terms of adoption to help them in adopting these best practices that have already been tested and that can get the more trust in such kind of regulations that would expedite the adoption much quicker. But I don't think that if every country is going to work independently in testing these regulations, it will take a long time. And again, we need to harmonize also these regulations and policies. Again, the data is going to be the fuel of digital economy. If we don't have the same language cross-border, then we would never benefit or harness the opportunity of this economy.
So this strikes me that there's another skills shortage. We talked about the skills shortage from the research about within businesses, but there's also a skills shortage within the public sector about and part of, I think, what your organization is doing is trying to find ways to create that learning across many countries, but you've identified a second attribute, which is, can we have common interfaces, common rules, common learnings to speed up the curve that at least the public sector needs to go through to create the right sort of environment?
Exactly, Azeem. This is exactly the essence of the Digital Cooperation Organization, which is creating that space for governments, private sector, and also civil society to co-create and co-design these new regulations and policies together from the beginning, and also for these nations to share best practices together. If there's a solution that is working in one nation, why not share it with the other? And it goes with policy and regulation as well. Something we're working on as we speak is a repository between member nations where they would share all the policies and regulations as well as systems and create a market space for even solutions to be shared among these nations together, which would help and expedite their growth.
So that starts to, if as it works, it starts to level the playing field in some sense. Now, we are also at this moment of time in a point of real technology transition with many really interesting technologies coming to market, you know, renewable solar power and 3D manufacturing, 3D printing, and so on. So there's always the potential for leapfrogging, for countries not to always follow the same well-worn path that some of the advanced economies have taken. But does this moment in time make us think differently about leapfrogging? And perhaps, Paula, Minister, I'll come to you first.
And I wanted to come back to that. So leapfrogging, in essence, what it means is you don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Right.
And to Deemah's point, when you have organizations like the Digital Cooperation Organization, you have Smart Africa and all these other different platforms where, you know, we can share experiences. And the reason we share experiences is not just to see what has been done elsewhere successfully, is also to serve the purpose of how do we bridge the skills gap that could be on either side if you're talking about policymakers. And I want to give a very unique example. Let's assume Rwanda is setting up itself to be a financial hub. Maybe you have Saudi Arabia, UAE that already are a financial hub, and they've had some years into getting that done. Now, any company that has presence in those markets that are already, dubbed as financial hubs, there's something that was right about those markets that made them get there. So if they're looking to expand in another market, let's say on the African continent, does it make sense that we go back and, boil the ocean trying to figure out what regulations do we put in place, or do we look at other financial hubs, what they've done right, and sort of, borrow those lessons, those practices, put it in place, and then allow for this market expansion that has to happen and becomes a natural progression for many companies that are looking for elsewhere to go. And when we're talking about particularly innovation and startups, you imagine a healthcare startup or agri-tech. I mean, when you look at the kind of innovations happening on the African continent, if all 54 countries have their own regulations, do you imagine a startup that has to go through 54 different sets of regulations?
Yeah.
Scale will never happen for them.
Right.
They'll die in the process. And so I think, to your point, this is where, whether it's collaboration, experience sharing, where it's really important as we think about leapfrogging, because I don't have to reinvent the wheel. I just need to learn from what others are doing and try and do it better. Because maybe I don't even have those legacy systems that could hold me back from moving faster, but even further than what I'm already seeing.
Well, I'm going to ask André to share some of the experiences then of InnoSwiss and what are the best practices of that interface between the public sector and in all of the tools and capacities it has, from provision of public goods to incentives to regulation to other types of policy making. What works well when you're trying to foster a technology into an innovation into a market?
So one of the key rules that we have in Switzerland is to privilege bottom-up approach, to consider that it's not the government or the political system that will know better than the one that is researching what may make sense. To be completely open to new approaches. After, you need to have something that is competitive, not to consider that every idea will have equal chance. So equal chance if it's good, but fundamentally some idea may make sense, some other not. So you have a filtering system that the best idea will be rewarded. But having said that, the concept that we have as InnoSwiss, we will fund the part that is done in academic research. And the company that will be interested to get access to this technology, it may be a SME, it may be a large company or a startup, will have to bear its own costs. We have new provision now that allow to do that differently, but fundamentally, you need to have skin in the game. So you have some good ideas. The good idea needs to be proved by a group of experts, but the ultimate element is a company ready to pay their own part of the development and the research to make the idea become a product or a solution. That has been proven to be pretty efficient.
Yeah, that bottom up and have faith in the bottom up, the people with the expertise, I think is a powerful idea. But I'm also curious about the importance that governments can play in signaling that they have faith that a market will emerge, because we've got the entrepreneurs and the scientists working on the one hand, but the thing that will fuel them will be the capricious financial markets that will just put capital to anyone as long as there's a return. And it strikes me that governments have an important role in being able to say, we believe a market should exist in this area. And I'm just thinking, Erik, like, what can we learn about how that should get done well, and what are the things that governments need to avoid in those circumstances? Well,
I couldn't agree more with your point. I mean, part of it is funding and resource and infrastructure, but part of it is a coordination role and just signaling what's important. About a decade ago, the U.S. government made some big investments in Solyndra, a solar power company, and Tesla, a small car company and battery. And what they were signaling was that solar and electric cars were important. The Solyndra investment didn't pay off. The Tesla one worked out okay, and actually quite well. But both of them signaled that these were a set of technologies that were important, and they were going to backstop it a little bit. Since then, the improvement in the cost of solar energy has just been staggering. It consistently, year after year, beats the estimates, and part of that is because there's been a rush of brain power and resources and investment into that field, and it's growing, I think, exponentially in terms of how much that's improved, and that's allowed us to deal with climate change and just energy costs a lot better. Likewise, electric vehicle sales are skyrocketing. It took a long time for that to happen. You can have a focal point where you have gas stations and internal combustion engine cars, and they all kind of fit together. And it's hard to get out of that equilibrium unless there's a coordinated effort to switch to a different one where you have charging stations and batteries and an infrastructure for electric cars. And that's exactly the kind of role government can play.
I love that. I would put one caveat, though, which, of course, is that what happened with Tesla and Solyndra was that the governments made specific bets on who at the bottom of the innovators were the smallest places were going to be successful. They got it right with Tesla. They didn't get it right with Solyndra. Was there an approach to setting the right incentive around markets that doesn't involve specifically choosing particular players, but rather says bets on a sector?
Sure, let me add a little bit. I mean, I'm in Silicon Valley now, and next, about a mile from my house is Sand Hill Road. Right. Do you think that all of the ventures that they back end up being, what is Tesla worth, $200, $500 billion, I don't know. Of course not. I mean, you take a portfolio approach, and it would be unrealistic to expect a private investor in young ventures or the public government, which isn't any smarter, to have a perfect track record. That said, I agree, this is only one tool in the toolkit. There are other tools. As an economist, I have to say carbon taxes would be a great way to do it. Everyone else hates carbon taxes except for economists. Right. And that would send a broad signal that if you have a method of production that's very light in using carbon, you're going to have lower taxes. And if you have a method that uses a lot of carbon, you're going to have higher taxes. And then we'll let 1,000 flowers bloom. People will figure out different ways, and some of them will be things that no government bureaucrat or policymaker or professor ever could have anticipated. And that's a great way to do it more broadly across the board as well.
Of course, please, Deemah, yes.
Can I add on that? I think that, a lot of the government's role is within the markets that needs very high capital or capital intensive specifically, that needs that boost, and then until private sector can adapt. Like, for instance, if we're going to look at submarine cables, for instance, and such kind of intensive investments, the hardware for hyperscalers and clouds. And so I think this is where the government should be working with financial institutions, the likes of the World Bank and so on, to invest in such kind of infrastructure that will enable the private sector to come up with the new emerging technologies and the markets for these new emerging technologies.
Yeah, that's important. Please, I would love to hear the perspective from a sort of a smaller economy as well,
right,
from the US.
And I wanted to just give a very practical example. 26 years ago, when Rwanda was really, putting in place the foundations for a digital economy, we had such a nascent industry, probably non-existent Googles, because we were coming out of the genocide against the Tutsis. So everything was really from scratch. And so we had only one telecom operator. We had to think about liberalization, but we had to make the deliberate decision to make investments in, building a 2,500 kilometer fiber optic cable across the country. Because what this meant was that it was going to be a catalytic investment for the private operators to then come in and then deliver last mile connectivity. So I think that is part of how a government can signal that this is the kind of market we want to create. Then the second one is a more recent examples. We're thinking about the transition to electric mobility, where we've had to have very special tax incentives for electric mobility solutions. And so that in itself, yes, it takes time. It's not going to happen overnight, but at least you're signaling an industry and a market that you want to create, and doing what it takes as a government to enable and create that market.
It's really interesting, that distinction between governments coming to establish enabling infrastructure on which the applications can be built, and then coming in to absolutely create an incentive to trigger a rush of capital and players into a specific market. But then one concern that I would have in this discussion is, how do you maintain a sort of a dispassionate, science-driven approach in the choices that are made? I mean, governments are themselves susceptible to capture. And I'm from the UK, and you may remember for a short period of time last year, we had a government in place that was very much against certain aspects of solar panels, and it was not science-driven. So that's maybe a question about good governance in general, but there are obviously risks if we start to say markets really need the public sector to be created. How do we make sure that the public sector is going to behave well? Maybe, André, I'll come to you on that, and maybe I'll ask Deemah to follow up.
First element, we should consider that for new innovation and technology, we should not look at country borders. If you have a great innovation and the market is in a different country, the market will judge it. Now, coming back to the question of bottom-up, I think the reality is that you need to have a good combination between bottom-up to let the best idea come through and some element to say that, for example, energy storage is a major question that needs to be addressed in a way that renewable energy may make sense. And don't forget, at each individual governmental level, you may have failures. But what is important is that overall, globally, you find places where something will be done right. And you cannot consider that each time things will be right. You need to have the chance to do the thing wrong, because if you don't accept the failure, you will never be ready to make something disruptive. And this right to fail is something fundamental in this approach.
That echoes something that Erik said earlier as well. But Deemah, when you think about your role and the governments you'll work with, how will you either give them the confidence to fail and the confidence to perhaps fail well rather than fail badly?
Well, I think, again, going back to the concept of cooperation, making sure that we are really open together and we share data as much as possible and we help each other to prosper. I think it's a time now where we can't work independently. No nation can transform alone, and no private sector can also support alone. I think we have to change the narrative to complement and complete each other rather than compete with each other, to really generate that inclusive global digital economy.
Wonderful. Now, we will come to questions from the audience here as well, and there is a mic running around. So if you do have a question, pop your hand up and I'll try and take it. While you all think, I want to come to you, Erik, on the question of productivity and the relationship between the new markets that could be created and productivity. We are seeing this productivity slump really all over. Persuade us that these new markets might turn the productivity problem around.
Yeah, I'm very optimistic about that. And so I've put my money where my mouth is. I recently made a bet with Bob Gordon, a longtime technology pessimist, amazingly good economist, a good friend, but he has a dim view of productivity in the next decade or so. I took an optimistic view, and we made a bet on the long bets that I thought productivity would be substantially higher than the Congressional Budget Office and others predicted. And the reason for that is twofold. One, I think that there's a wave of just really impressive seminal technologies that are coming out. I was a little disappointed when you put up your map there that there's only one light blue country that picked artificial intelligence. I thought they should all be light blue, because I believe AI is whether you say you're interested in healthcare, you should be doing it with AI. Whether you're thinking you're interested in these other areas, it should be done with AI. And so the Chinese got it right on that in my mind. But the breakthroughs, especially just the past year or two with large language models and generative AI, have been quite impressive. So that's going to unleash improvements in biotech, in energy technologies, in just about every area. But a second thing that's also very important is that these things do play out with a lag. And we've analyzed the way these lags work. The reason that there's a lag is that when you have an impressive technology, whether it's the steam engine or electricity or AI, it doesn't instantly transform businesses, and there's a new set of skills that need to be developed. Historically, it's taken a decade or more for that to translate into productivity growth. And as we analyze, we call it the productivity J-curve. At first, there's actually a fall in productivity, and then it takes off. And the reason for that is initially you have to invest a lot in rethinking your organization, in reskilling your workforce, even changing the institutions in your economy in the public sector. That is not easy to do. And even if you have the technology ready to go, those other changes can take years or a decade or more. We've been making those investments in advanced countries. You can see that showing up in some of the data. And now we're in a position to start harvesting some of those benefits. I think we're at the turning point of that J-curve. So we had a period of actually below trend productivity growth that's now, I expect, to rebound in the coming decade.
André? Did you have a comment? Sorry.
I would just say that when you have new technologies, it's not enough to be a success. And what should be also looked at is what is a needed ecosystem to make it happen. And very often, if you have a very disruptive technology, you will need to have other technologies of support that will make it, successful. But what we need also to understand is that the price is something fundamental. Because if you have something that is absolutely great, but costs twice the price of the existing technology, that will never fly. You need to have something that is disruptive, better, and cheaper. And then it can be a success.
But a number of the key points that have just come from Erik and from André are, again, about capacity and cost. I think, Erik, your words were, it's going to cost a lot. And André, you've talked about the importance of ecosystems. Now, Silicon Valley has had 50 or 60 years to develop its ecosystem and the world's biggest economy, smaller economy. Do you think, Minister, that there are lessons that you can take to reduce that cost, to still build ecosystems, to avoid becoming technology takers, but still being able to have some agency over the technologies that are created in the markets of the future?
And I think that's where the idea, the ranking that we see from the report that was launched yesterday around skills and talent, then makes a lot of sense, because the only way you can think about bringing costs down and really being and stopping at and not being technology consumers but creators is having that skills and talent base. Now, it's also understanding the supply chain of everything. It's understanding what is it going to take to deliver a much cheaper and affordable technology. Will it make more sense to import it or to even build it in country? So there are trade-offs. Again, I like to say there's never one size fits all for everything. I'll just give you a very simple example that we're all looking at when it comes to the cost of the smartphones, where a big part of Africa, you still find so many people that will find it very expensive. And so there's been a lot of attempts, even with our country as Rwanda, to sort of figure out, can we think about bringing assembly and manufacturing capabilities within the country? Will that necessarily lower the cost of the smartphone for our people? And what will that mean if you lower the cost? Are there trade-offs to make in terms of the specifications that you're looking for? So it requires really looking at all these aspects and figuring out how you build your own capabilities in country that will allow you to drive the cost down, because ultimately affordability remains a bigger barrier when it comes to the digital economy.
And I have a question about affordability, because many of the reasons why these advanced technologies are expensive is that in the advanced economies, we've constructed regulatory systems that enable them to be expensive. For example, intellectual property law and trademark and so on. Are there ways of, in a way, almost eliminating certain aspects of markets by choosing public goods or open source as ways of driving down affordability, even if it does affect the ability of a potential digital monopolist to excel?
I would say yes, that would be one form of driving down the cost when you look at it from the intellectual property side of things. But there's also looking at what are some of the costs, when you look at the cost structure, what are some of those cost drivers and where do you have room to make those changes? Now, even just picking the example I just shared of a smartphone, it may not be that you're going to significantly reduce the price, but you're going to think about financing models around it. I think primarily what you see in developing countries is that if a smartphone for $100 is very expensive, and many countries people have to pay the cost upfront. Can you then think about flexible repayment models, but also packaging and bundling it with other services that then makes it more affordable? So I think it's really those different nuances that you have to play with. You may not drive the cost down, but figure out a flexible way of paying for that cost, that product or service.
Now we've got 1 minute left. Thank you so much, and I want to just do a quick fire across each of the panelists, starting with you, Erik. Just briefly, if there's one message to policymakers about how they should approach supporting the creation of new markets, what is that? What's that one message?
digitization opens up a whole new way of running businesses, but also a whole new way of managing and regulating businesses. And just as the private sector needs to reinvent itself, the public sector needs to take advantage of these technologies, not just AI, but the whole digital infrastructure to do a reinvention, for instance, of our measurement framework. It's all done in a way that was amazing for the 20th century, but doesn't take advantage of the tools we have for the 21st century.
Digitization, fantastic. Deemah, your one message.
My one message is that we really have to incorporate the private sector and the innovators within the design and development of our reforms when it comes to digital economy.
Thank you so much. André?
If I'm just back to one of the first elements we have got is issue with talents. I think that one of the best things that we can do going forward is to have a better international collaboration in a way that even country or place where you don't have critical mass can be part of a project, and then you emulate an innovation that is cross-border.
Cross-border. And Minister, for your
that
peers.
That would be advice to myself. I think it would be openness to risk. And then agility in the way we build regulations and policies, and finally, it's partnerships. We can't do it alone.
Oh, well, thank you so much for those final words of wisdom. Many, many new capabilities and skills for policymakers to take on. Thank you to our expert panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.